Joining with us, the Pulitzer Prize-nominated Canadian journalist Barry Brown. Barry Brown has written over 3,000 articles for 120 news organizations. Hello, Mr. Brown. Warm welcome to our studio.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. First of all, many congratulations to you. Your new book, Humanity, The World Before Religion, War and Inequality, has gained a lot of praises from historians in India and North America. Before we go into that, tell us about your background and your early childhood.
Oh, wow. Geez. Okay, what can I tell you? Well, I grew up here in Toronto, so I always wanted to be a writer, and I always had a broad interest in lots of different kinds of people and lots of different subjects. Wanted to be a theoretical physicist when I was a kid, but I couldn't do the math. That was really a problem, so I had to settle for reporting on science rather than actually writing about it. I got into journalism as a writer, like we were talking about before. You know, I wanted to do creative writing, but my stuff, I wasn't good enough, you know, when I was a teenager. So by the time I hit my 20s, I started to do some journalism, and by the time I was in my 30s, I was being a foreign correspondent for a lot of American publications covering Canada. And that's been the springboard that got me into this book.
Coming to your book now,
Yes.
Tell us something about your book.
Well, I started off here's the book. And so I started off with a little obscure quote from Aristotle that caught my interest. So Aristotle said, the Jewish people are descended from the Brahmin priests of ancient India. And I was real curious to know whether that was true or not, because I'm Jewish. And when I was younger, I spent some 3 years as a Hare Krishna monk, studying Sanskrit and the Vedas, and I was initiated as a Brahmin, with a fire ceremony and the sacred thread and everything. So I was just real curious to know whether the old guy was right or not. Anyway, to make a long story short, the Jewish Bible says that human civilization starts off in the Garden of Eden. And according to the Bible, Eden is in the easternmost part of a larger land called Havilah. Now, where was Havilah? Well, according to the 20-volume 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia, Havilah is India, according to more than 2,000 years of Jewish and Christian traditions. So now I had a new question. If biblical history starts in India, almost 6,000 years ago, because the Jewish calendar is 6,000 years old, or a little less than, what happened in India that could have started the history? So one thing was clear to me as I began the investigation is it couldn't be a religious event, because there really aren't any organized religions 6,000 years ago. People who are called Hindus and Hebrews, for example, don't exist yet, and they won't for 1,000 years or more. The word Hindu comes from the people who lived at the Indus River Valley, which is later. Okay? So whatever happened, it must have been an event of such momentous importance in human history that it was almost like creating a new kind of human being. And that event is the world's first war, which is the war that ends ancient India's history 6,000 years ago in the Mahabharata. Because as I started to find afterwards, as I was doing sort of back and forth research, see, there's no evidence of organized human war anywhere on Earth before about 6,000 years ago. And it turns out that the war described in Mahabharata is really the first truly large-scale organized human war that brings down an entire civilization.
You mentioned that the war at the end of Mahabharata is the same story that begins in the Jewish Bible.
That's correct.
How did you discover that both histories are connected?
Yeah, they're sort of two halves of the same story. Yeah. Well, again, you sort of start off with, you know, kind of a theory, and you work to see whether the theory holds. So, since I was basing the first question on Aristotle, was this true? And you say, okay, well, apparently biblical history does start in India, according to 2,000 years of Jewish tradition and Christianity. Okay, so what happened 6,000 years ago? I know it's the war. So then the question becomes, okay, is this war, if that's the story that's really at the heart of the Garden of Eden story, that this notion of the fall of man from a time of, if not innocence, less violence and less greed, to a time of greater violence and greater greed, as is also described in the Indian text, the beginning of Kali Yuga and the earlier yugas, which were less violent and less greedy. So, does this make any sense? You start to see that there are parallels. The timing seems right, all of the other evidence. What about going forward? Because you can't go backwards, right? Earlier Indian history doesn't include the text that follows afterwards. So then you look afterwards and you go, okay, the next two events that are concerned with the early Hebrew people of the Bible, and that you can look at to see if there's any outside evidence that ties this in, that gives us more credibility. So the other two events that follow after the war story, the fall of Eden, would be the story of Noah and then the story of the Exodus. Okay? These are the main stories that concern people called the Hebrews. Now, let's go back a little bit. Okay? If the war story is Eden, okay, and the next thing that happens is Noah. So the Noah story in the Bible basically is not very long, and it doesn't give you a lot of details, but it says wherever Noah's family comes from, there's a time of terrible droughts and terrible floods, and then eventually everybody leaves, okay? I mean, if you take away all the religious aspects of the story, you have three waves of migration that go from some place where they start from into Europe, in Eurasia, into the Middle East, like Mesopotamia, and into Northeast Africa, where a lot of Indian settlements have been going on since practically the beginning of time. Okay, so now the word Hebrew, these new people that emerge in the Jewish Bible, the word Hebrew means homeless wanderers who come from the East. And they don't appear until after the story of Noah, which is linked to about 2000 BC. So again, being a good investigative reporter, I look and I go, all right, what happened in India 2000 BC if this is still a continuation of the same story? Well, what happens is the collapse of the Indus River Valley civilization. And we know from the history that when this collapses from climate change around 2000 BC, waves of migration start flowing out, some back to India and some outside. You can see the genetic trail. So some of the people who end up in Mesopotamia, the local people call these migrants, these homeless migrants, they call them the Hebrews. And the word Hebrew means homeless wanderers who come from the East. So then you go, okay, so now the Noah story matches up with this idea that biblical history begins in India and starts to migrate out after the Noah story. And then with the story of the Exodus, I don't know how many of your viewers are familiar with it. It's usually taken as a story about slavery and liberation from Egypt. The actual story is about the conflict between different religious groups. It's actually the story of the first extremist religious groups. And one of the conflicts is between the Israelites, who are in favor of social segregation by classes, you know, like a Brahminical class, and having formally organized temples and priests who are untouchable, like Brahmins, and having all of these religious laws, 600 different religious laws. The Hebrew people are kind of like the liberals, okay? So they come before them, and the thing with the liberals is they believe if God's got a problem with you, he'll take it up with you in his own good time. So they don't have any religious laws, they have no official priests, they have no temples, and they have none of that stuff. So the conflict starts to come with this new revolution between these hardline religious types, who would be very familiar to people in India, because all over the world you've got these hardline religious types that are basically evocative of the original ones, which is this story from the Exodus. Because before that time, you don't have extremist religions because you don't have organized religions. Okay? So that's where it begins. So you start to see that all these things fit. And then finally, as you go through all of the other stuff and you see language that gets passed along, Hebrew writing that comes out of the Indus River Valley letterings, and then finally you look at the genetic trail. Because after you look at all of the rest of this stuff, you figure to yourself, okay, if this is true, then there has to be a genetic trail, because that's the gold standard, right? If you find a genetic trail, there's really nothing you can debate about it. So I found the genetic trail. The links between, as we were talking about before the show, the original Brahmin family and the original what are called Levites. These are the born Brahmins of Judaism. So when I saw this connection, I actually called one of the top geneticists in Judaism at Albert Einstein University in New York. He said to me that their research doesn't go back that far. They only go far to the beginning of the Levites. So that's the time of Moses and Aaron, about 1300 BC. He says, if you want to know earlier, then you need to talk to the top guy in Indian genetics, Dr. Lalji Singh at Hindu University in Benares. Ask him. So I did. Called him up and I said, hi, I'm calling you from Toronto. Here's the link that I see between the Brahmins and the Levites. What do you think? So he says to me that he was so flabbergasted, he said, I'm going to delay the release of my paper on India's genome to look into this for you. And he wrote me back and he said, well, our examination of the Jewish people of India, some of whom have been there for 3,000 years, shows that their paternal and maternal heritage, genetic heritage, goes back to Southwest Asia, not the Middle East. And he says, all of India's written history all agrees with you too. You'd have to, he says, do a complete analysis of all the Jewish people around the world, but from what we've seen, yeah, you're right.
If the Jewish Bible begins in India,
Yes.
then what other parts of Jewish history come from India?
Well, it's the traditions really that passed it along. So, for example, the word Shabbat. Okay, so we have, Saturday is the holy day, the day of rest, and the word Saturday in English and in Sanskrit and in Hebrew is named for the planet Saturn, which is a slow-moving, restful planet. And the word that is used for that is the word that we have for Saturday and for Shabbat, and comes from Sanskrit, the Sanskrit name Shabani for the planet Saturn. Okay, and then you look at things like, where does the Star of David come from? Because it's originally an Indian symbol, the heart chakra. So it turns out that King Solomon, this very famous king from the Bible, Israelite king, gets his gold from India to decorate a temple in honoring his father David. And according to my research and what it says in the Bible, the city that he gets his gold from is not only on the coast of India, but the ruling family is the Yadavas, who are part of this same family tradition that comes out of the Brahmin line and out of the Levite line, you see. And according actually to Kashmiri legend, Solomon visited Kashmir. And there are a lot of places up there that are named, like the city of Solomon or things of that sort that are named after him. So there's a lot of things. The more you go through, the more you can see the evidence. In fact, I think there's 2 or 3 places in the Bible where it describes what God looks like, and all times describes him as having blue skin.
Mr. Brown, we will continue this chat, but right after a short break. Welcome back. After the break, we have in conversation with us the Pulitzer Prize nominated Canadian journalist Barry Brown. Mr. Brown, we all know that the Bible is a sacred book to both Christian and Jewish communities. But now how they have responded to this research?
You know, everybody has been very positive about it that I've mentioned it to. I spoke to a minister, a Christian minister, and he said to me, Barry, you realize you've discovered the Rosetta Stone for understanding early biblical history. I've spoken to a lot of Jewish rabbis and Brahmin, Levites rather, and they're fascinated because that part of Jewish history, like the war story, is considered to be a fable. They don't really know what it all means. And by pointing out, here's probably what the historic event was that inspired these things, everybody gets really excited. The first comment I ever had actually was from a Muslim imam who told me, who said, congratulations on this masterpiece of research. So I basically had good play all around.
How long was the research?
About 8 years, a little bit more.
So this is all very, very fascinating. So tell me, what inspired you to begin this research?
Well, as I said, I sort of came across this quote from Aristotle, and I wanted to know if he was right. And as you probably know, when you're a reporter and you get hooked on a story, that's it, you're hooked on the story. You got to keep following it until you find out the answers. So when I started to see right off the bat that there was this connection, or at least, it looked legitimate once you start off with Eden, then you just keep going into it more and more, and you can't get out of it because you keep wanting to ask these questions. And then it becomes even more interesting, because if you go, okay, if these two cultures are connected, and this is sort of the beginning of human civilization, and this is the beginning of religion, and both of them seem to indicate that before this time, there was no war, and the world was less violent. Maybe not perfect. It wasn't like everybody was singing, songs and nice to everybody all the time. Little bits of violence here and there that always happen. But generally speaking, compared to the world we have today, there were no large wars. There were no armies. They just didn't have them. They weren't putting them together because they didn't need them. So then that brings up a whole new question. If we didn't have that kind of violence, and if human civilization didn't evolve through conquest and wars, how did we get here? How did we begin to create a common civilization of travel, trade, and language that spread all over the world for 3 million years, from the time of Lucy in Africa 3 million years ago to the first war of about 4000 BC, 6,000 years ago? That's 99.9% of history. What were we doing in all that time? Our impression for most people from films and television is that we imagine all of these early humans savagely clubbing each other and killing each other and grabbing, trying to get the latest mastodon or something, beat a bit of food against somebody else. But if we were actually behaving that way, then you would see isolated languages. Everybody would have their own different little language. They wouldn't really be sharing culture because they would always have been from the beginning afraid of other people, not wanting to share. But when you think about it, how do we create, say, language in order to have a common language? If we don't have trust in the beginning, you're not going to share my words and you're not going to pass them along. Okay?
Yeah.
So in order to create the common civilization of travel, trade, and language that we obviously have, you have to start off with a culture of friendship and trust so that you will take my words and share them with others and we can start to create a common language. If you didn't trust me, you wouldn't share my words and they wouldn't be common languages.
Yeah. Tell us what lessons this history has for this today's modern world.
Very good question. Well, I think we've been touching on it a little bit. I think the idea is today in the world, there's so much propaganda telling and encouraging people to be selfish, to think that violence and selfishness and greed are a natural part of human life, they're a natural part of evolution, that it's the only way that anything survives is by only caring for itself and not anything else. Now, we all have to be concerned with ourselves, to be sure. But without a world of other people that we're sharing with and building things with, we wouldn't have the studio, we wouldn't be sitting here talking, and we wouldn't have all these amazing inventions and progress that people have done over the years because we've shared information right from the beginning. That's how we created this. And to try and think about the future as something new and different to create peace is how people who say that life is violent always get you. Because they think, oh, you're trying to imagine something that never existed. You're all just dreaming and illusion. But that's not true. The original way that people were working was cooperatively. There is no evidence of war. In fact, of the 8 million species, 9 million species of life on Earth, only 3 go to war. Some ants, some chimpanzees, and some people. Yeah. And of the 3, we are the least warlike. So I think the purpose of my book, or one of the important things of my book, is to remind people that that's not true. And that building relationships is really the most important thing in the world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, for taking our time and sharing all this information with us. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Wonderful talking to you. Thanks.